here for the last session. There's beer in our future, in the near. Show of hands, programmers. Programmers, woo! Designers. QA. Product managers. VAs, analysts, spec writers. All right, excellent. Everyone that's necessary to build product, right? So, innovation in the software world comes down to creating a product, right? We're going to write code at some point. After all the process and the planning and everything, we're going to create an application, right? So 20 years ago when I started, maybe a little bit before 20 years ago, but we employed this technique called top-down analysis. We're going to design the system and we're going to write it, right? And then not too long ago, in the early 2000s, we went lean with this concept we call MVP, right? Anyone heard of MVP? Follows MVP, advocates of minimal viable product, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about minimal viable product. Let's look at, maybe I should stand over here, where it came from. Oh, I can see him right here. So there was this gentleman by the name of Eric Ries, wrote a book called The Lean Startup, and he put the definition in, to MVP. I won't read it, but everyone's familiar with it. The concept basically is that we're going to create an early edition of the product with the least amount of effort that will get us the most validated input back from our customers, right? So we want to create a product that's just good enough that customers are interested in it, and then we're going to get feedback, and through what we typically call iterations, we're going to improve the value of the product over time, right? And it's not really so different from the technique of just getting to a version 1, you know, and then version 2 is going to be a little bit better, et cetera. But the key is that that phrase, validated learning, right? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. At the last presentation of the day, the batteries are about dead on the little thing here, so I'm having a little problem with it. So the MVP approach relies on 2 principles to work. Number 1, minimal can't exceed viable, right? So what happens if our product is not of value? The release of the product is not of value, right? We're not going to get adoption. Nobody's going to look at it. We're not going to get that validated input, right? And then it also relies on that the iterations after the MVP have to be valuable, and we can't run out of money, right? We can't exceed our resources, right? So we're going to get to MVP, and we're going to start collecting that validated input, and then we're going to make corrections, improvements, et cetera, to the product, and hopefully we're going to achieve something of value in an overall cost that's better than if we had just tried to get to the end, you know, with one shot, right? But what if what must be minimally accomplished is well known, right? We know exactly, there's really no minimal. We have to write this system, right? So certain systems with legal requirements, there's the minimal requirement is well documented, well defined. It's not controlled by our customers, it's not defined by us, it's just what it must be. Or what if the concept is so innovative the users don't really know what they need, right? It's going to prove a problem of defining what the MVP should be, right? So that's actually the situation that I worked in with a company that I created a few years ago called Emerald Software. I'm going to talk about in just a second. But my name is Chuck Ross. I'm a senior business analyst here at SoftServe. I'm based in Atlanta in the US, so I'm obviously visiting this week. And I worked most of my career as a programmer. I still introduce myself as a programmer. I don't get to code nearly as much as I would love to do, but for the most part I act as product manager or analyst or business consultant or something like that. Little flash up there. I've built and sold 3 software companies, so for the most part I've been a product leader and built products. So at Emerald Software, my third company, we set out to build a just-in-time order entry system. So this was a product that allowed my users to enter some data that generated some forms. It was all in the sales order process. And our intention for the product, kind of our minimal goal, was that I would be able to go into any customer and say, tell us about your order process, and I'll be able to represent it in our product. So our product required flexibility, right? It had to be a configurable product. So in that sense, that level of flexibility, that level of configurability was minimal, right? We had to build it that way. So unbeknownst to me at the time, we weren't talking MVP back in 2003, 2004, but we built a platform, right? We weren't following a minimal viable product. We were following a platform approach instead of building a particular product. And the interesting thing is we found a market totally different than what we set out to build a product for. So not once did we sell it as an order entry system. So we were aiming at a target and we hit bullseye on a completely different target. That's basically what we were doing, or what happened. So the MVP approach requires a good bit of investment understanding those user expectations so you can get as close to that initial target as possible, right? Minimal can't exceed viable, right? It has to be at least attractive to the user so that they'll adopt it. We can get those validated inputs. So MVP is like trying to hit a bullseye with a laser, right? So that's where I get the term laser from the in the title of the presentation. So did I get it right in the Ukrainian?
No.
No? All right, he did it. Because I didn't come up with that, right? The thing about MVP is if you miss the bullseye too far, those iterations to get back to the value that your customers require is going to be expensive, right? Lasers are expensive. So the iterations, if you're way off on your bullseye, way off on your MVP, are going to be expensive. You could run out of resources to complete your product, right? This flexible approach I'm advocating is building a product, right? It could result in creating a successful product even if you don't hit your bullseye on it. So it's like a shotgun, right? Did we get that right? Right. Everyone knows what a shotgun is, right? Laser is the beam. It's very focused, right? Shotgun sends out all those little BBs, little balls, and it kind of creates this scattered pattern, right? So we're more likely to hit the center of the target, the bullseye, with the shotgun. So that's why lasers, MVP, platform with a lot of flexibility, shotgun, right? So you're more likely to hit the bullseye, and if you miss, it's just a shotgun. It's cheap. The iterations are going to be a lot less expensive than the typical MV approach. We're going to talk a little bit more about why that is. So let's go back and review that definition, right? And how we make MVPs work, right? Least effort. It still requires effort, and it's sometimes not trivial, right? We have to do our studies. We have to understand what's minimal and viable, so that the minimal doesn't exceed the expectations, right? And it depends on delivering sufficient value to gather those validated learnings and those iterations that we talked about. Oh, that was my sound effect. Let me back up. All right. So we're going to hit it now? No. Who said PowerPoint's not fun? So those iterations, right? Every time we had to retarget, those iterations, those are done by our programmers, right, in an MVP. Now imagine the extreme, like a system that has zero flexibility. There is no configurability in that system, right? That implies that our iterations are going to be done by our programmers. And for the most part, our programmers are our most expensive resources. They're our scarcest resources, right? We can't afford to waste our most expensive resources, right? So those iterations, if there are going to be a lot of them, are likely going to be expensive. So, sum total, if the iterations are off, then what's going to happen? All right, we're going to run out of money. So MVP still rely on assumptions, even if they are well researched and validated. And those assumptions might change as we're building the product, right? So we're hitting a moving target, right? It's bad enough that we've got to focus the laser and get it in the bullseye, but the target's going to shift as we're working on it. And in fact, that's such an accepted, we always have to assume that the target is going to be moving on us. I keep jumping to ahead. So we have to balance delivering the product close enough to the mark such that the cost iterations don't suck the company dry. Because that makes us sad, right? We run out of money, we can't pay the programmers anymore, we all have to go home, and we don't have a product that we can recoup our funds with. So, is everyone expecting? Did you hear? Yeah, okay. How about this one? That's a big shotgun, I think. All right, so now the platform approach, we still have to make assumptions, right? We have to know how to get to that first release, right? We still have to make some assumptions. So that problem is not going away, and unless we're perfect in figuring out what those user needs are, we're still going to need to tweak our software. But the thing is, if we've made our software a platform, then the iterations are going to be a lot cheaper, right? They're not necessarily going to be done by the programmers, our most expensive resources. The iteration is going to be done faster because we're not talking about the whole build cycle, the release cycle. We're talking about changes in configuration, right? They're going to be done cheaper because they're not done by our most expensive resources. And in fact, sometimes they can be done by the users, which now users are expecting a lot of flexibility. That generally makes our users really, really happy, right? So the platform approach is basically to build in flexibility and configurability in our product. Sufficient that we can overcome missed or changed assumptions of bad data, and then appeal to users even when their needs are never, and we didn't even anticipate the needs. So, the source of all knowledge, Wikipedia, says that a platform is a group of technologies based upon other applications. I think that's a pretty decent definition of what a platform is, right? So why a shotgun approach? You're probably saying this guy is turning the world upside down, and he's telling us that MVP is not appropriate anymore. We should be building platforms. That's actually not what I'm saying. We as product managers, we have to make good decisions, right? We have to know when it's appropriate to use one technique or tool over the other. So there have been some changes since MVP was released as a concept. So some of those changes do affect our ability to create platforms, right? When MVP came out, we didn't have cloud. Now we've got cloud, right? So infrastructure as a service, on demand, everything, basically is now at our disposal. Programmers are more valuable than ever, and iterations are more expensive than ever, right? That's all the programmers in the room, right? Just swimming in money, right? And like I said on the last slide, customers expect more and more flexibility and agility than ever, right? So MVP is not dead. Shotguns are not better than lasers. Lasers are not better than shotguns, right? They're both tools that product managers should apply in the right way, right? So it's our job to figure out when it's appropriate to use one or other. And for that, we're going to kind of turn back to kind of the old school project management, scope, time, and resources triangle, right? So this is my stab at kind of a rule of thumb kind of chart. Given scope, time, and resource constraints, when is it appropriate to build a MVP type approach? When is it appropriate to build more of a platform kind of approach, right? So let's start with scope. let's say the scope is well-known, well-defined, and fixed, right? That legal system that I talked about earlier, right? The government tells our clients this is what they should do, so we need to build a system that's going to deliver on those statutory requirements, right? That's an example of a very well-known system and functionality. So in that case, a laser is better because we know exactly what we need to get done. The investment in that first version is fixed and predictable, right? Shotgun approach is not real appropriate in that because the cost to implement that extra bit of flexibility is high and it's not really necessary, right? If we have to build a system a very specific way, then why build the flexibility into the product, right? The next one, if the scope is not well known or it's undefined or there's a lot of risk in whether our assumptions that we've collected are high, right? Whether we've done a good job of not collecting that information really doesn't matter. If the product is so innovative, it's hard for us to get feedback from the clients to know kind of what they would minimally expect. They don't have expectations if they've never seen it before, right? So in that particular case, a laser the MVP approach is not good. Your chance of hitting the target the first try is actually really, really variable, right? So in that case, it's going to be better to implement a shotgun approach, right? The inevitable iterations, because we know we're going to have iterations because we're not so certain about the first version of the product. Those iterations are going to be cheaper, right? And sometimes the customer will take the product in their own direction. And that's exactly what happened at my company, at Emerald Software. Remember I said we were trying to build an order entry system. Users found a different application for it altogether. And as long as they were willing to give me money, I said, that's fine with me, right? So resources, in a situation where you've got abundant resources, you've got plenty of money, you've got the war chest, which never happens, right? My point here is, if you've got the resources, why wouldn't you build the flexibility into the product, right? It's kind of a theoretical because it doesn't really happen. We never have unlimited resources. And by the way, this can be applied to a project. So if we're doing something internal, it doesn't necessarily have to be a commercial product. A project can follow the same thing. So if a project has a fixed budget within the company, obviously we want to pay attention to how much resources we're going to have at our disposal. So usually not the case, etc. If we have limited fundings, which is typically the case, then we're probably going to follow the scope guidelines, right? The resources is not really helping us, so we're going to pay attention to the scope. So really, in kind of a way, unless you have unlimited resources, the resources doesn't have a whole lot of impact on it. Now we get down to time, short time to market, long iteration curve. What's going to be better? MVP, right? Because it's a limited bit of functionality. Short time to market. We've only got this amount of time. Let's build exactly what we need to get it into this time to market. Then we got long iterations. We can make corrections over time, right? So obviously the laser MVP approach is going to be better because building that flexibility takes longer, right? So short time to market, shotgun approach. Flexibility will take longer, so we know the iterations will eventually be faster and cheaper, okay? So longer time to market. If we've got more time to market, and when would that happen? Right, if we're building an innovative product, nobody's seen it before, unless we're being hit with known competitive pressures, unless that's the case, we probably have a little bit more flexibility. Let's get it right. Let's put a little bit of flexibility into the product, because if we miss because we don't know exactly what the expectations of the customers are going to be, let's go ahead and build a little bit of flexibility. So in that particular case, building a minimal product might hurt us in the long run, right? So More time to invest in the flexibility, and iterations are faster. And the iterations could be even free, right? Keep that in mind. The iterations could actually be done by our customers. So, and there's another combination there, short time to market and short iteration curve, right? We've only got this amount of time and we better get it right, right? Well, probably the MVP approach would be better in that particular case. But if you don't get it right, you don't have enough time to correct because your iteration is going to take you longer than your final time. So just a couple more slides here on how to implement a platform approach, right? Implementing a shotgun approach. Number one is generalizing the underlying business processes, right? You have to understand, to build a platform, you have to understand the components that you're going to need in the platform, right? The services, et cetera. You have to thoroughly understand the processes. An example is employee timekeeping. I mean, you could think of, checking in with the little cards or, using an app on your iPhone or whatever. But that's the app, that's the front end, kind of like the design ecosystem that Jean-Paul was talking about earlier. But think about the underlying business process. There's the check-in, check-out, there's documents and records prospecting, the actual record of the time. There's the review and approval workflows. You think about the processes instead of the app. Now you have an opportunity to start identifying the pieces and the components that you can build as part of your platform. So anticipate, this is kind of obvious, anticipate where the flexibility is most required. So what functionality is most risk for missing the target, right? What do you have the least input from users when you're building the system? What is the stuff that you can't get enough information on to make decisions about your design? Those are probably the areas where you ought to build flexibility into the system, right? So, example, a document-centric system where the documents are dated, right? So in the US, we have tax forms, and in 2019, tax form is going to expire December 31st. We obviously are going to want flexibility there because otherwise we've built a system that works this year, and on January 1st, it doesn't work for the users anymore, right? So identifying where you need the flexibility. That's an easy example. Sometimes it's not so clear-cut where you want to identify where the flexibility is. Utilize more off-the-shelf services, right? So if you take an off-the-shelf component, it probably already has a certain degree of flexibility in it, and you're going to inherit that flexibility, right? The obvious one is public cloud services. So if you incorporate SQS, RDS, or any of the Amazon web services, you're inheriting the flexibility of those services, and you can leverage that, after you're released to the market. Another example I've seen is using open source tools. So if your product requires a BI and visualization tool, use an open source product like Superset instead of writing all that, and you inherit all the functionality of the open source tool Superset, and it becomes a module in your platform, right? These are decisions you guys have to make. That's why I say these are the tools, the product manager. You still have to make good decisions. You still have to decide which scenario and which situation is the best fit for you. Apply the architecture of engines and services. It's very similar, but a little different. The idea here is that we're going to concentrate functionality into some service provider that is going to give you those processes that we talked about, number one, to begin with. The best example I can think of is like a business rules engine, right? So, that's my example. Business rules engine, instead of hard coding those decision trees that might, need to be changed based on customer feedback. And just in general, apply the shotgun rule to every product requirement decision, right? So when you are making your decisions about the product feature functionality, capabilities, when you're establishing the roadmap, ask basically, is there any conceivable need for this to vary? conversation in the last couple of days. I was talking about you're really good programmers, and you all are, right? Really good programmers always build flexibility, right? So if there's some kind of setting, like your SMTP, settings or whatever, they put that in a JSON file or something like that, right? All programmers do that, right? Well, you kind of make the conscious decision of let's make the system at least flexible enough to be functional. In fact, we came up with the term minimally viably flexible, right? Okay. So just an example, you've got two users that are giving you opposing information. Like this user sees it, and this should be this. So now I want to enter A, then B. And this user says, no, we have to enter B, then A. Obviously, you're going to make that configurable by the user, right? And if I sound like I'm advocating a services-centric architecture, I am. I mean, basically, platform is a services-oriented architecture or microservices architecture, which is really one of the reasons that it's very popular. Right. All right. So summarizing. Right. Okay. The laser approach, right? The main thing I want you to remember is we have total cost, right? Minimal viable product is going to take us to some point in the consumption of our resources. And then we've got iterations to get it the rest of the way, that deliver the value that's needed. If those iterations go beyond our total budget, we run out of money, right? In a shotgun approach, the iterations are cheaper, right? So we can go a little bit further. If we have a little bit more time, if we have the flexibility, those iterations are going to be cheapest and not consumed by our most expensive resources, and perhaps even free and conducted by our customers. So that's it. Let's go build some wonderful, exceptionally valuable products.
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. Any questions? Yeah, one here.
Thanks, Chuck. And what about the POC approach? And if you're talking about POC, can we apply all this like shotgun and laser approach to POCs as well? Or
yeah. Proof of concept. Proof of concept in kind of the stream of product management. The proof of concept comes before a first release. Comes before an MVP, right? Proof of concept is to validate some idea, concept, technology, etc. But yeah, absolutely, you can apply the same thing. But the thing about the proof of concept is you're just trying to validate that one, maybe two, or a limited set of technical things. Yeah. If you need flexibility in any of those concepts, any of those things that you're trying to validate, absolutely. Yeah. So, all right. Yep.
So MVP approach is known enough. Could you please make an example of platform which is released? So on abstract level, MVP and platform is okay for me. But
Yep.
Could you give an example of platform?
Actually, the product that we created. So at my last company, at Emerald Software, I told the story that we wanted to create an order entry system, right? So we kind of visualized and spec'd out the minimally viable functionality. I mean, that's really what we were trying to do, but it required so much flexibility. So we built a state engine, basically to represent workflow, but it was data-driven, because if I go to you and say, how do you place orders for your product, and I go to someone else, that workflow might be a little bit different. So that state engine was attached to what we called a HTML renderer. So it created web forms. All right, We didn't have, the jQuery and fancy stuff back then. But so we were just generating, HTML page after HTML page. But the way that it looked to the user was a kind of a rules-driven wizard. So if I entered something on this page, right, I'll get to this page. But if another user enters something different on this page, we go to a different page. So it was a state engine with a renderer attached to it, and then we had this forms and document service over here that took all the data and it populated into the forms and records, right? So that was the platform, right? We could have just written an order entry system and tried to make every screen where you could edit the screen and just save the forms of the screen. We made the decision to build in this degree of flexibility because it was just seemed obvious. It would allow us to represent more variability in customer rules, right? Now I've seen some other great examples of platform-centric, ERP systems. Pretty much anywhere where you see a service-oriented architecture implementation or a microservices architecture, it's built in a platform function, and unless they built services that are not configurable, which I don't know really why you would want to do that, it's going to inherit the flexibility of those services that the platform is built on. Okay.
Okay, Chuck, we have a few online questions, actually. One of the main questions of this evening, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, another one is, do you think it's possible to make shotgun of lasers? Lasers.
That is I think, if I understand the question, that is the minimally viable flexibility that I mentioned, right? So build a shotgun of, either that or it was meant as a joke, one or the other. But yeah, you can apply MVP, you can apply platform. More than likely, you're going to need to apply kind of a meld of both, right? So you might look at some of your functionality and say this is very well known. It's driven by legal requirements or whatever. That can be approached as minimally viable. Just code it, right? It doesn't need flexibility. Just build it. But this other subset of functionality, like dashboards in a BI system, you need a lot of flexibility in that, right? People think differently. They want to see different visualizations. They expect customization and configurability, in their hands. That's where you might want to concentrate building, your flexibility.
Yeah, another one question is about, could you please provide an example when you first built a platform instead of product?
Actually, the example I gave Emerald was not the first. The first was an ERP product that we worked on. It was another company's product. The company doesn't exist anymore. They were acquired a couple times. But I took inspiration from their product. At the time that they built their product, people built accounting, financial, ERP, and operational systems monolithically, right? They just built, here's a data entry screen, for general ledger, here's an AP voucher entry screen, whatever, and that's what accounting systems were. Now, unless you went to the enterprise and had a product like SAP or PeopleSoft, but in the middle market, that degree of flexibility didn't exist. But these guys kind of went in a different approach. They built a tool upon which they built their forms, their screens. So that's kind of the approach that I was talking about earlier, is that their forms in their application were not compiled. They were driven by a configuration, right? So every time someone loaded a screen, it went out and grabbed the configuration. Well, that also implies that configuration could be edited, right? So there was a designer tool that allowed them to make changes to the forms so people could customize every screen in the system. It was revolutionary at the time. And unless, like I said, you went to the ERP. In the middle market, it was revolutionary. So when I built our product in my third company, kind of took inspiration from that flexibility. I saw the value in that flexibility, and when we're seeing all these decisions about, I don't know or I can't anticipate the business processes and the forms that my customers are going to need, I knew that we had to build flexibility in it. You could say that was minimally viable flexibility. We had to build that flexibility, right?
Any other questions?
Always ready.
Okay, thanks,
That it?
Chuck.
Thank you.